Thank you all for joining us. My name is Daniela Bleichmar. I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation about Natalie Lauren Belisle's new book, Caribbean Inhospitality, The Poetics of Strangers and Homes, out from Rutgers University Press this year. Joining us in conversation with Natalie are Jossianna Arroyo-Martínez, who is professor of Latin American and Caribbean literatures and cultures at the University of Texas, Austin, and Yolanda Martínez-San Miguel, who is professor and Martha S. Weeks Chair in Latin American Studies at the University of Miami. And the conversation will be moderated by our colleague Nayan Shah, who is professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History at USC. Our program today is in partnership with the Department of Comparative Literature and Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures at USC. We do invite everyone who is joining us to turn on their cameras if they are able to do so. It is much nicer for the speakers and especially the author to be able to see the faces of colleagues and friends and students who have come to hear her talk about the book. Our program today is very simple. Natalie will start by introducing us to the book, telling us a little bit about it. And then we are going to open it up for conversation between Natalie, Jossianna, and Yolanda. Jossianna will be asking the first question, and then we will have the conversation moderated by Nayan until roughly 12:45 California time. And then we will invite questions from all of you who are joining us. At that point, Nayan will let you know when it is when the floor is open, and we will ask that you raise your Zoom hand so that he can see you clearly and invite you to ask your question. So, Natalie, many congratulations on your book, and please tell us about it.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Daniela and Zach and the Levan Institute for graciously hosting this book talk. And I also would love to thank Yolanda Martínez-San Miguel and Jossianna Arroyo for graciously agreeing to moderate. And also thank you to my colleague Nayan Shah at USC. So I'd just like to talk about what motivated this book and some of the central ideas behind it, and then we can move more into specific questions about different chapters. So in a yearly undergraduate seminar that I teach on Caribbean literature and culture, when I ask students at the beginning of each class what comes to mind when they hear the Caribbean, what do they think about when they hear the Caribbean, there's almost always an overwhelming consensus that is represented through some emblematic words: beaches, pirates, lots of resorts, and a very luxurious place that ultimately nourishes the curiosity and adventure and respite of foreigners from outside the region. This rather commonplace view of the Caribbean elides its centrality in the founding of Western modernity in the aftermath of Columbus's arrival to the Bahamas on October 12, 1492. This founding moment, as I argue throughout my book, becomes the catalyst for Western Europe to remake itself into a global power, to craft a vision of the world with itself at the center, and importantly, to conceptualize the key principles of modernity: sovereignty, citizenship, man, and citizen against this new world other. In our more recent history, the Caribbean has been invoked metonymically for a kind of endlessly translatable global principle, the general condition of our postmodern world, marked by endless cultural contact, planetary flows, territorial displacement, and global exchange. From Columbus's first encounter with Caribbean natives in 1492 to the development of tourism, the Caribbean has been configured and imagined as a zone of cosmopolitan hospitality, a space whose people, for better or for worse, unconditionally welcome strangers seeking repose and refuge. My book, Caribbean Inhospitality, The Poetics of Strangers at Home, explores how this legacy of hospitality has shaped and is entwined with expressions of regional and national sovereignty, and in particular, the meaning of citizenship in the post-independence and post-colonial Caribbean. One of my goals in this book is to question and to return back to this question of why the project of post-colonial sovereignty in the Caribbean has failed. And I link it to this legacy of hospitality that we can trace from Columbus's first contact with the natives and also through his work, which I'll discuss later. Tracing the relationship between politics and aesthetics, and envisioning the political as aesthetics, this book mines Caribbean-based literary, visual, and digital texts that characterize Caribbean post-colonial sovereignty and citizenship as a myth, fiction, and fantasy that belie the lived experience of Caribbean citizens. Spanning the 1980s into the present, the corpus of texts I look at in my book suggests that citizens of Caribbean nation states have become estranged from the political processes of the state within the countries they call home. Against this backdrop, my book bridges two seemingly disparate accounts of contemporary Caribbean life: a narrative of cosmopolitan hospitality that caters to foreign consumption, and the inhospitality lived and felt by citizens of Caribbean nations. In doing so, the book asks, how have Caribbean nation states' relations with foreign entities, settlers, tourists, investors, and an international political community influenced the political representation and recognition of Caribbean nationals as citizens? This book sets out to answer this question by reframing the recurrent myth of Caribbean hospitality as fundamentally inseparable from political sovereignty, from the project of political sovereignty that unfolded in the Caribbean beginning in the 19th century and that shaped the post-colonial discourses of the region in the 20th and 21st century. That is, insofar as Caribbean nations affirmed and exercised their right to exist as sovereign states, against and in the face of European and North American neo-imperialism, they did so ironically by significantly replicating the political constitutions bequeathed to them from their former metropolitan protectorates. This book demonstrates that such failed attempts at transplanting and translating the law of sovereignty, belonging, and membership from an elsewhere to the Caribbean has created a political terrain that is inhospitable, a key term that I use throughout my book, to juridical subjects from Caribbean nations. And as they soon discovered, this sovereignty was contingent on making themselves intelligible and accessible within a world, cultural, and political system engulfed by neoliberalism. Caribbean Inhospitality analyzes how the intelligibility and indeed a condition of hospitality of Caribbean sovereign politics on an international economic stage paradoxically necessitates the unintelligibility, erasure, and silencing of Caribbean citizens whose difference and particularity is perceived as a threat to the sovereign state, insofar as the sovereign state must make itself intelligible to the world or within an international political community. It contends that sovereignty for the Caribbean nation has not necessarily translated into a greater sense of membership, belonging, and representation for citizens, but rather has engendered a deep sense of estrangement. My book defines the stranger, which is one of its key concepts, not as one who originates from outside the political community, the nation state, or the region, but rather one who belongs to the Caribbean nation. And thus, my book makes the counterintuitive claim that the self-estrangement of the Caribbean citizen subject, in fact, conditions their membership in the nation state. The transhistoric sublimation of the Caribbean into both a receptacle and a constituent element of what lies in the world beyond its borders informs this book's guiding question about how Native Caribbean peoples are shaped and live as human beings, citizens, and subjects of nation states that seem to exist for foreign interests, ideas, and peoples. Depictions of the sun, sea, pleasure, and service that the Caribbean offers to its visitors elide the fact that Caribbean peoples, even those working jobs in service of visitors and the visitor economies, have lives that call upon them to vote, deliberate, speak, and be represented as citizens and subjects of these states. But this book is a book that is fundamentally about citizenship as a fiction. The law says that someone is a citizen of such and such a country with certain rights and responsibilities. We take what is written at face value, but in reality, as my book outlines, there's a gap between what is written or stated and the reality of citizens' lived experience. We see that this reality looks different for different people. We're seeing, even beyond the Caribbean, we can think of our present moment, that not all citizens are seen or heard in the same way. And therefore, as my book does, we have to resort to other tools of analysis, tools that take us to the terrain of representation or aesthetics to make visible what is actually happening. And so my book hinges on a basic premise, one that we can trace through the works of thinkers like Hannah Arendt, Giorgio Agamben, and Colin Dayan. Citizenship is, in fact, a legal fiction, a conjuring of a political identity into existence. But the fiction of citizenship, and with it that of sovereignty, is connected to a much older fiction, the fiction of the Caribbean as a meeting place of strangers that welcomes everyone from everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. That was amazing. And a great summation of an extraordinary book. It's a real pleasure to be part of this conversation. I want to direct the first question to Jossianna Arroyo-Martínez to get the conversation going.
Yes. So Natalie, I'm really excited about this conversation today. Thank you for inviting me. This is a beautiful book. It is a book that is really urgent. It's a book that speaks to our times. So I'm really grateful to be here and being able to discuss this book with you. A lot of the book has 4 chapters, and you start with an introduction and a code, and you have a coda at the end. And the book starts. And makes. I start with when you finish, right? Your last idea of the Caribbean as a place and a site from where a lot of that has taken place historically. It's kind of like foreshadowing the rest of what happens in the rest of the world. And it's not Caribbean peoples that say this. It's kind of historical. So I found like really intriguing your mention of Christopher Columbus and the way you use Christopher Columbus in your introduction, right? And kind of like seeing that encounter between the native and the native Caribbean and Europe, as a starting point of what we're seeing in many ways today. So I want you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure. Thank you. I turned my attention to Columbus for several reasons. Part of it has to also do with my own training in colonial Spanish American literature. But I wanted to, when I was, revising and writing the book, I didn't have Columbus in mind. And then I realized that when we go back to his text, specifically his Diario de Relación, so his diary, his journal, and the other 3 relations of his voyages to the New World. Columbus, I started rereading it and realized that it's the discursive and textual origin, right, of this fiction of both hospitality and inhospitality that is central to my book. So Columbus's narrative, his journal, and his relations set a precedent or an archetype that I argue continues to be enacted discursively, politically. So I see hospitality, Caribbean hospitality, and also inhospitality as something that begins textually, that is enacted textually and discursively. And Sylvia Wynter's reading of Columbus is also very important to me, because Wynter is trying to think about how, through Fanon primarily, and some Foucault, how writing or genres of writing, and writing very broadly, whether it's literature, representation, repeats itself and sort of enacts patterns in what she calls a law-like manner, right?
Yes.
So how writing enacts patterns that themselves become law, right? Or the regulatory systems, right, that end up regulating human behavior, right, transhistorically, and as I show, right, can be seen within the law. So Columbus's narratives, as I said, sort of set a precedent and an archetype, first discursively, that later becomes enacted politically. And I want to reiterate, I was interested in the narrative power of Columbus's writing as a text that sort of inaugurates and fixes Caribbean natives simultaneously as hosts to European strangers and also as aliens or outsiders in their homelands. And I focus on one particular scene in his diary where his ship arrives to Cuba, and the natives are coming out to greet him on their canoes. But the way he frames this encounter and the way the translation, because I'm also interested in how translations of his texts, right, help enact this discourse and politics of hospitality. The way he frames the encounter with the natives is as though they are visiting his ship, right? So they are they become visitors or strangers that he hosts, right? And this sets the stage, right, for the subsequent conquest and colonization of the Caribbean.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So
You're going to turn the dialogue to Yolanda and then
Yolanda, okay.
yes. Yolanda Martínez-San Miguel, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And again, Natalie, congratulations on this wonderful book.
Thank you.
I'm also very happy that we were able to publish it in the book series I co-edit. This is one of the best parts of co-editing a book series, that you get to know the best work that is coming out and in the field. So I'm very happy to be here. Representing not only the book series, but a colleague that is also very happy to be able to engage in a conversation with you. So my next question has to do with on chapter 1. You actually mentioned Walter Rodney's The Groundings with My Brothers, and to explore a critical understanding of this idea of Caribbean unity, right? And so I wanted you to talk a little bit more about Walter Rodney, being that he's such an important figure that some of us, I would say many of us in the Caribbean tend to not know his work that well. So could you expand on your use of his work and why you chose him?
Sure. So just to give a very quick overview, my first chapter wanted to think about what we can call Caribbean discourse, and particularly Caribbean discourses of cross-cultural unity. And I wanted to think through how those discourses of Caribbean cross-cultural unity are weaponized or instrumentalized in ways that actually silence the discourse or the political deliberation of citizens. And so I turned to Walter Rodney because specifically it's his text, The Groundings with My Brothers. So Walter Rodney, for those who are not familiar with him, is a very foundational Guyanese thinker, writer, scholar, and activist who is mostly known for his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. But his first notable book is actually Groundings with My Brothers. And in this book, he is being quite critical of the middle and upper middle class elite in Jamaica for using the rhetoric of oneness, right? One love to keep the poor, specifically the poor who are undoubtedly racialized as Black in their position. And what's interesting, this book was published in 1969, and it recapitulates an actual dialogue that Rodney was having with Jamaicans. But Rodney, for those of you who are not aware, was actually banned from Jamaica precisely as a result of his critique. And so I turned to Rodney again because he was offering a very subtle critique of this one aspect of Caribbean discourse, specifically discourses of Caribbean cross-cultural unity. So whether it's mestizaje, creolite, creolization, one love, or out of many one, right? So he was specifically pointing in the context of Groundings with My Brothers to the national mantra of Jamaica, and showing, right, how this discourse is weaponized in such a way that it prevents poor Black Jamaicans from deliberating and speaking up against their condition. And Groundings with My Brothers fascinated me because it's also a book about how to deliberate politically. So it's a meditation and also an instruction manual about what common political deliberation looks like. And that is what my second chapter, or excuse me, my first chapter is about. My first chapter is about failed political deliberation as seen through a short story by Ana Lidia Vega, Jamaica Farewell, and the Barbadian visual artist Anna Lee Davis's experimental documentary Migrant Discourse.
Thank you. Turning back to Jossianna.
Yes. So I'm moving to chapter 2 with a question. And you start chapter 2 actually working specifically with Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican literature as a site that provides modes of unintelligibility in relation to Puerto Rico's legal status as a free associated state, and a form of, and you call this a form of juridical disorientation, right?
Yeah.
How does the politics of legibility and what you define as disorientation in this chapter are seen on these two authors that you examine? And you work with Yanina Bracci, novel Y Yo-Yo Boing, and with Eduardo Lalo's Los Países Invisibles and La Inutilidad. How a politics of disorientation could offer us a type of critique of temporality, place, and belonging, as well as a new language for global literatures today.
Sure.
I mean, so two questions. One about disorientation as a model, and the second about how Puerto Rican literature could, in many ways, jump us into this kind of like global temporality break.
Sure. Thank you, Jossianna. I want to actually answer this question through two anecdotes. The first is when I started thinking about this when I started working on this chapter, I was reflecting on the fact that if you ask at that time, I think now there's probably a bit more education, US citizens, what is Puerto Rico? Right, they can't actually, you know, what's Puerto Rico, what's its status, what's its legal status, what's its legal relationship to the United States. They can't give you a sort of intelligible answer, right? Talking about Puerto Rico from the US continent, right, produces a sort of disorientation, right, a confusion. And I actually started this chapter using the anecdote of Bad Bunny's Grammy performance where when he was singing and rapping, the translation provided by CBS, or the non-translation provided by CBS on the screen, was nonsense, right? Non-English.
Non-English.
Right. So, excuse me?
Non-English, yes.
Non-English.
Yes.
So, that's one anecdote, right? Like that even, a Puerto Rican subject who is, right, a citizen of the United States, his language, right, his expression was rendered untranslatable or unintelligible. And I found that that whole fiasco, the non-translational fiasco, sort of emblematic of the larger question of what is Puerto Rico. And there's another anecdote, which from Puerto Rican poet Nicole Cecilia Delgado, and I actually asked her for permission to share this and include it in my book, but ultimately I left it out for reasons of time and space. But the week of the devastating Hurricane Maria in 2017, Nicole actually posted a picture of a map of the Caribbean, I believe from the National Weather Service, in which Puerto Rico had completely disappeared from the map. So it was just it was like, it was Hispaniola. You could see all the other islands, even the smaller leeward islands, right? But Puerto Rico had just been blackened out. Again, very emblematic, or metaphoric of how Puerto Rico appears or disappears, right, as disoriented, completely out of time, space, and language. And so this led me to the larger questions that come up in Janina Brashi's Yo-Yo Boing and Eduardo Lalo's broader about how do we classify Puerto Rican literature, right? Because in their works, the problem of not being able to classify and describe Puerto Rico as a geopolitical legal space sort of translates into the inability or the problem of classifying Puerto Rican literature. And actually this came up in recent debates with writers like Marta Ponte, about whether Puerto Rico should be included, right, as US Latinx literature, whether it should just be read as strictly Puerto Rican literature, Caribbean, Latin American. And all of these questions come up rather explicitly in Brashi's and Lalo's text. And Brashi and Lalo, but Brashi, well, actually both of them, are the larger question that they raise is, if we cannot classify Puerto Rico and therefore its literature, how does Puerto Rico fit into the world, right? How does Puerto Rico fit or not fit, right, within these larger debates about world literature, right? The rise of world literary criticism in the last decade, 2 decades, right? Puerto Rico, how does Puerto Rico fit into this? And therefore, can we really talk about something like world literature, or what are the conditions that allow a text to be worldly?
Thank you. That's actually really amazing to sort of think about the kind of connections that you're drawing between disorientation and what counts as what kind of literature, and who gets to name it, who gets to celebrate it in some way.
Yes, thank you.
Yolanda.
Okay, so in the next chapter, you move to another, like it's very interesting because each one of these cases is very unique, right? And you move to Cuba, and particularly I was very happy with the way in which you were able to bring very new readings to some of the materials that have been studied by many of us, often. So, and you're taking this notion of hospitality, Inhospitality, to the, literary and, the blogosphere of the literary field and the blogosphere in Cuba. And so I wanted, I had many questions, but I'm going to ask you a little bit about the notion of hospitality and Inhospitality, and how it is transformed in the space provided by the blogosphere and the blog and other literary genres that are developed outside traditional formats and published books, which are spaces that are heavily restricted in Cuba. So tell us more about that.
Thank you, Yolanda. writing this third chapter on Cuba was a wonderful challenge because so much had been written about Cuban literature from what is called the special period and times of peace. And I was trying to think about how to approach the problem of inhospitality and the host in Cuba in ways that would not obviously repeat the wonderful scholarship on the special period. And what I was interested and what I discovered is that first of all, and I'll get to the blogging part in a bit. So the special period, as many of you know, opened up Cuba's economy to a form of to this very ambiguous form of neoliberal capitalism that took Cuba back to a coloniality or neocoloniality that many Cubans born in the aftermath of the revolution had not experienced. And at the same time, the conditions of work during the special period, specifically the conditions of work that brought about what I call freelancing, allowed, or freelance personhood, allowed Cubans on the island to work off the books in ways that also transformed their sense of what it means to being a person. And very quickly, in the Cuban Constitution, the concept of a person does not necessarily exist, right? The Cuban Socialist Constitution defines the citizen, right, as part of a common. And so I was trying to, in my Cuba chapter, I was trying to think about, well, this is interesting. There's a notion of personhood that's this sort of rogue personhood that is emerging as a result of this neoliberal capitalism that is entering Cuba off the books. And it's turning, as a result, it's turning Cuban citizens into hosts, both literally and metaphorically. So as it concerns the blogs, around the same time that this new form of personhood is emerging, censorship, right? Writers are also being censored, right? So they're having to write, just as people are having to work off the books, they're having to write off the books. They're not necessarily being given access to the publishing houses, which are regulated by the state. So with the emergent internet infrastructure that's developing in Cuba during the special period, and specifically in the second half or the early 2000s, 2007, 8, 9, Cubans are finding ways to write that don't require them to rely on publishing houses. And one of that is blogging. So in the second half of the chapter where I discuss blogging, I'm interested in how the internet, and specifically internet servers that are hosted in foreign spaces, allow Cuban writers who are being censored from writing and publishing in official government sponsored outlets, how this new internet infrastructure called Alba 1, so it's the actual line that's connecting the underground internet cable that's connecting Cuba to Venezuela and then other parts of the world, how writers are posting their blogs on these foreign servers, and then their writings are actually being uploaded outside of Cuba. Right, so I wanted to think about the server, right, as a host that hosts foreign writing, that hosts Cubans writing outside of Cuba, and then how does that transform, right, what we consider to be literature, or as you asked, Jossianna, right, What is that? How does that disrupt, right, the traditional format of the published book? That worked for a while. Obviously, the government clamped down on that. As I discussed at the end of the third chapter, new laws were put in place to make censorship even stronger. That sort of culminated in the J11 uprising.
Thank you. Jossianna, do you want to ask one more question or?
Yes. Actually, I have two, but I'm going to combine them. Natalie already has them. So Natalie, I'm interested in your fourth chapter. You discussed the novel by Pedro Cavilla, Malas Hierbas, and you work with Pilochet's Peuple of Terre-Mili, a novel that depicts the Parsley Massacre. I mean, definitely in this chapter, you're thinking Hispaniolas, race relations, particularly Dominican Haitian relations, and questions of citizenship, but also labor. It's a really beautiful chapter. I'm interested in the way you problematize borders through the Parsley Massacre. And I haven't read this novel, but I'm interested in knowing how this particular novel that has kind of like accounts of eugenicists, ethnographers, and intellectuals in the making of the ethnic cleansing before it happens, right? As it happens with the fascist state, how it differs or not from other representations or novels from the Parsley Massacre. I was also really intrigued by your reading of Cavilla and the question of gendered labor, right? Women, racialized women and labor. So just
thank you.
Yes.
I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to do my
Yes.
best to answer this with expediency. So I wanted to bring understanding to the meaning about the question and meaning of race in Hispaniola. There's a lot of discourse about how Dominicans identify themselves as Black or not Black, to the point where it's become sort of the butt of a joke. And I wanted to bring understanding and seriousness to that. By looking at how race, focusing particularly on the Dominican side, and then how that affects the vicinity, right, with Haitians, how the meaning of race was inscripted narratively by Rafael Trujillo, and by that I mean an ongoing and active project of telling Dominicans, right, you are not Black, you are the whites of the land, the blancos de la tierra, right? So again, I'm going back to, I'm thinking with Winter here about how race, right, how ideas, right, are inscripted in a law-like manner such that they actually regulate behaviors, right, and how people start to think about themselves. And they're regulating not only how people are thinking about themselves, but they're also altering, right, consciousness. So that is one part. The second part aspect of this chapter is I wanted to understand and think about the fact that you have two nations, right, that are bordering each other. So this gets to your question about the border. A fictive border that was drawn at some point at the end of the 19th century, how two people who coexisted as neighbors suddenly start to understand themselves as enemies. So the chapter is a lot about neighboring. And so I want to think about the border, not just as a geopolitical line, but as a skin, right? It's not a skin color, but skin. Typically, if we go back to Hobbes, right?
Yes. Yes.
The nation is thought of as the body politic, right? The skin is the border. So this idea of the border as skin comes up very strongly both in Philoctete's Le Peuple de Terre-Mili and also in Cavilla's Malas Hierbas. So the novels are thinking about and interrogating how Haitian, right, and Dominican subjects, right, who coexist as neighbors as one, right, as the people of a mixed land, to give the literal translation of Philotex's novels, suddenly start to see themselves differently through a narrative of skin, right, through a myth of skin that is being invoked by Trujillo, and then skin itself becomes border. So to get to the last part of your question, Jossianna, so you mentioned, or you asked about how these novels, specifically Philotex's novels, differs, or what it brings that's different from other works on the 1937 Parsley Massacre. You know, I was thinking of El Masacre se pasa a pie, right, by Freddy Pistola, and I was also thinking of Edwidge Danticat's The Farming of the Bones. El Masacre se pasa a pie, as you know, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the text regarding the genre, the question of accountability and responsibility, the sort of subtle blaming of Haitians. Philotex's text, I think what is different from both of these texts, but specifically El Masacre se pasa a pie, is that Philotex's text is premised on the idea that these are their neighbors. There's a shared history that suddenly is being disrupted. And you can see that in the very genre of the text, the otherworldliness of the text, this otherworldly, supernatural, marvelous, real framework of the text. Philotext uses that to connect that to the fact that the question of race, right? How race is being scripted as a fantasy that is also being used to redefine what it means to be human.
Thank you. We are at the moment when we are opening things up for questions. And so I want to have that opportunity. There's so many extraordinary people in the room here who have many ideas and many thoughts. We've just surveyed actually every chapter of the book. So there's an opportunity to delve in anywhere you want. And then we'll hold, Yolanda will hold a question in reserve just in case there's a moment of brevity and silence and stuff like that. I want to first, please raise your hand, but I want to first say that there's someone who's been very eager to ask a question, Cassie Jones. So Cassie, if you're here, do you want to ask your question? One of them? I'll ask Cassie's question then. Cassie's going to be shy or not here. Cassie asked, what was the most difficult chapter for you to write and why?
Actually, the last chapter was very difficult. You know, it started as an article, and then I expanded it, precisely because of the philosophical questions about race and what it means to be human that were coming up in both Philotex's and Cabilla's allegorical rendering of Haitianness and Dominicanness. And chapter 4 was about passing. So I wanted to think about passing, not just racial passing, but passing as human, or passing as a living being, which is connected, right, to whiteness and blackness. And so that, just from a philosophical, theoretical perspective, that was the hardest chapter for me to write.
Okay. Well, now we're going to hear from a friend, not a stranger, Ronald.
Hi, Ronald.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Natalie. Congrats. It's great to be among so many dear colleagues. I mean, I do have a question, but I also just wanted to show up and also just congratulate you. And it's truly special to see this moment, truly. So I guess my question is, what, you know, I mean, our books get published with these strange temporalities, and then events happen, and then they acquire different legibilities, right? So I wanted to ask you in relation to Puerto Rico in particular. Your book deals so centrally with the trap of citizenship, and like, what do you think about the current situation that's going on, and how would that maybe require either rethinking or extending the work you've done? And I'm thinking about specifically, on the one hand, the situation that most of us in the island, the diaspora, are anticipating, which is at least or potentially foreseen, but of course, who can tell the future, an intensification in the push towards independence for Puerto Rico, finally, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, how that may also continue to have to deal with the question of race, specifically Blackness and anti-Blackness in Puerto Rico, and the way U.S. keeps being positioned in Puerto Rico in a very tense field of antagonistic positionalities. A lot of times flame up, for example, with regards to Bad Bunny, in relation to his reclaiming of the pava, of the jíbaro, as a symbol of this kind of like new sort of reclamation of like a creolized identity in Puerto Rico. I think there's a lot of stuff happening, you know, since 2025. I just would love to hear your thoughts, since I cannot just go to your office anymore and talk about this. So,
you know, and I want to add to that, right? There's still the specter of Puerto Rico being sold, right, in exchange for Greenland, right? So that was also part of the debate. Okay, so I want to answer your question actually in relation to my reading of Eduardo Lalo, because in chapter 2. So in my reading of Lalo, I talk about how he's a complicated heir to Antonio Pedreira, and complicated because Lalo is emblematic of, his writing is emblematic of what could be called like a decolonial critique of Puerto Rico's non-sovereign status, right? So again, going back to, as you said, this push for within the pro independence sector, and specifically writers, right, who are espousing that position for sovereignty, and also, right, which also aligns with a critique, a decolonial critique of non-sovereign status. At the same time, in my reading of Lalo, and this perhaps could be applied to the larger question of race that you raise. I found Lalo's decolonial critique of non-sovereignty sort of problematic, because I felt like it was espousing a return to a Hispanism, right? And you and I have talked about this, that is reminiscent of Pedreira, and a Hispanism that would be fundamentally anti-Black, right, among other things. So, you know, we look at Lalo saying Puerto Ricans are in this predicament, right, because they don't have the capacity to even articulate their predicament. I found it reminiscent of Pedreira's critique, right, of Puerto Ricans' language, right, this sort of being in between, not speaking proper Spanish. We can amplify that emblematically, right, to think about how, you know, whether sovereignty, to your point, is actually going to resolve other issues, right, such as anti-Blackness, and we can attach other issues to that. And so that chapter sort of is open-ended, and I probably don't have a direct answer to your question, but rather an invitation to think about, because this book is not necessarily, and the conclusion that I arrive at the end of this book is not saying that we need to return to sovereignty. In fact, one of the questions that this book raises is whether sovereignty, post-colonial sovereignty, any type of sovereignty, can actually be repaired. A decolonial, and I'm very cautious. I did use that word twice in my book, but I'm very cautious about using it. A decolonial critique of sovereignty would, in fact, you can't decolonize sovereignty. Right, because sovereignty is wrapped up in a host of other issues. So I don't have a sort of resolution for this, but rather an invitation to think about, you know, when we're fighting for sovereignty, and a host of other things. What other negative aspects are being reified, whether it's anti-Blackness, homophobia, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. Are there other questions that people have that they want to pose at this moment? We just had that moment of sort of seeing the kind of conversation we'd be eavesdropping on over the years. I'm going to jump in with something that I was so struck by in the very end of your book. And I was thinking about this throughout. It's like, it seems like you were constantly coping with the vicissitudes of possibility in different ways, and the ways in which they're shut off. And you sort of spoke to this in your last comment, but I want to just sort of quote you in saying that citizens' strangeness intrudes upon the meaning and power of the sovereign nation state, a political community inherited from the legacy of European colonialism. In intruding upon the law of the sovereign and standing at its doorway, I see the condition of possibility of a Caribbean community that is yet to come. It's a turn that reminds me of your first chapter. And I just want to ask you, what do you think are the possibilities of a Caribbean community yet to come?
Yeah, and I actually want to expand that to what are the conditions of possibility of a community right now that is yet to come, considering everything that is happening in this country, globally, but especially in this country, right, where the laws are constantly being transgressed or instrumentalized, right, against citizens. So this would be a second book, or an invitation for others to possibly articulate in a book. Can we come up with, imagine forms of community, right, within this collapsing nation state project, whether it's of the United States or within the Caribbean, that allow us not only to survive, right, but to exist wholly and well within the nation state? Because I don't know if the nation state can be saved. It's collapsing, right? And so what's interesting is that when I first started this project, even as a dissertation, I was actually trying to see if texts would allow us to imagine alternative forms of community. And what came up ultimately was fugitivity. And I'm not sure if I'm content with fugitivity, because I don't want to, I'm not, endless running, right? Endless fugitivity is tiresome. So, you know, I guess my conclusion would be that the nation state project is collapsing. I don't know if there's any form of rehabilitating it, restoring it, reforming it. And I think the situation that those of us who are in the US right now, living and working, are showing us that we need to imagine alternate forms of community that perhaps rely on things like mutual aid, among other things. I'm not invested in rehabilitating the nation state project. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Oh, and I think that's really so striking, because I think that's one of the things that one could have started off thinking the book was about, because you go from different nations that are in the making and also estranging the people within them, right? And so it's such a remarkable way of trying to thinking. I really do appreciate that you're also not you're seeing fugitivity as a condition, but not of the possibility that you want in the Caribbean community. Any further questions, thoughts, declarations?
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's really great seeing so many people, and shocking. I appreciate it.
It's a wonderful tribute to this extraordinary book.
You deserve it. Beautiful book. Congratulations.
I also want to note that one of the comments in the chat was thanking you, Natalie, for your courageousness in doing this work. That is not something to take for granted these days. It is my pleasure to thank Professors Yolanda Martínez-San Miguel, Jossianna Arroyo-Martínez for joining us for this conversation. My dear colleague Nayan Shah for being an impeccable moderator. And above all, Natalie, many congratulations. Thanks and congratulations on your book. It's really a pleasure to have read it and learned so much from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.